what's important to see is that they only fired one missile. And as you remember, just a few days ago, they set off quite a complex attack involving drones and various kinds of missiles, lots of different targets. And now the most they can manage is just one. It hit the ship, and I think that's the first ship that's actually been hit by one of these missiles. But obviously, the missile was not a very high explosive one, in that the ship seemed to be unscratched, and thank goodness. But I think what we're seeing is how the Houthi capability is degraded by these attacks.
Well, Sir Mark Lyle-Grant is with me, former UK ambassador to the UN and former national security advisor to the Prime Minister. Sir Mark, thanks so much for being with us.
Good evening, Kate.
Hello. I wonder what you made of Rishi Sunak's words this afternoon. Did he get it on the button? Did he get his assessment clearly across? Was it well pitched?
I think so, yes. And he didn't really deviate much, or Keir Starmer didn't deviate very much from him in response, to be honest. I think he can rightly claim that the escalation has come from the Houthis, who have increased the number of their attacks since the middle of November, and indeed targeted British warships and American warships that have been protecting commercial shipping going through the Red Sea. And that the response by the British was first diplomacy. There was the statement of the 10 countries warning the Houthis off. We then had a Security Council resolution by the United Nations, which wasn't blocked by Russia or China, so it was adopted, which condemned in the strongest terms these Houthis attacks and noted the fact that member states could take measures to protect their shipping and indeed shipping more generally. And so really it was a last resort, and it appears to have been reasonably well targeted and proportionate, I think, to the threat that the Houthis faced. So I don't see why that in itself should escalate the conflict further.
Okay. So a word of caution there on escalating things further. I mean, there has been another attack on a US container ship today. When we reported this story on Thursday, we broke live on the show that there was going to be military action taken, the eradication of military bases, launch pads for drones and missiles in Yemen. That all happened on Thursday's show, and the sort of script very much was then, this is a single action, this is targeted, and this will nip it in the bud, to use common parlance. And I don't know whether it's done that. What's your perspective? Are we going to see more strikes? Are we going to see some escalation from the Houthis here? Where do you think it's going to go?
Well, it's difficult to judge that from outside because I haven't seen the damage assessment of those strikes. But given their targeting, and it was a pretty substantial range of targets hit, I'm sure it would have degraded very seriously the Houthis' military capacity. But my expectation is that there will be an attempt by the Houthis to retaliate. They certainly have the political will to do that. The question is how much military capacity they have left. We've seen 2 attacks. You mentioned the one today that hit a US-owned container ship. There was one also yesterday. But I don't think we'll know for several days and perhaps weeks whether the Houthis really have the capacity to keep up these attacks after the US and UK strikes.
Grant Shapps, Defence Secretary, said the UK directly warned Iran over the Houthi strikes. Why did Iran not heed those warnings?
Well, I think there's a couple of things here. I mean, one is that it's not clear that Iran is directing the Houthis specifically to target shipping. They are a pretty independent lot and a very resilient people, the Houthis. So I think they have their own interest in keeping themselves in the public profile and showing themselves to be part of this axis of resistance against Israel and the West. But equally, I think Iran is happy to use its proxies, whether that's the Houthis in Yemen or the militias in Iraq or the Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in Gaza, just to keep the sort of the pot boiling, as it were, without getting themselves directly involved. Because a lot of commentators, you'll recall, Kate, 3 months ago, were saying it's inevitable that, Iran is going to up the ante and Hezbollah are going to come full out and attack Israel because of what was happening in Gaza. And that hasn't happened. And I think that is a clear sign that Iran does not want a full-scale war with Israel, let alone with the United States. So I would expect a continuation of this sort of low-level conflict using proxies rather than some much more strategic widening of the conflict in the region.
So Iran can continue to operate through its proxies. It means that they're isolated enough not to start another major war, not to start a war with the West. It can continue to sort of punish the West how it wants through its proxies. I just wonder what you made of Grant Shapps' assertion this afternoon that Britain should be preparing for further wars. He says we're in a pre-war phase. He's mentioned China, Russia, North Korea and Iran, and that he expects wars involving those countries to be erupting over the next 5 years. I was pretty taken back by that, and I just wondered how much you thought that was performative, whether that was Grant Shapps, playing defence secretary, which he's entitled to do, or whether you would also heed a similar warning like that. How close are we to, direct war involving those countries?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, to be honest. I mean, there's no doubt that we are in a dangerous world. We've got a full-scale war going on in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. We've got this Middle East conflict, which is now 3 months in and no real sign of it ending soon. We've got the potential flashpoints in North Korea and Taiwan and China. I mean, all that is true. But having said that, I think there's a little bit of posturing from Grant Shapps here. I don't see us being imminently drawn into a much more global conflict, because I don't think any of the main global players, the big players, as it were, actually want to get involved in that sort of conflict. So yes, there's a risk of miscalculation, there's a risk of things going wrong, but personally, I would not be quite as apocalyptic as the Defence Secretary was sounding.
And look, finally, some will say, well, one way to stop any escalation in the Red Sea or beyond is for Israel to scale back their operations in Gaza. And I wondered what your view was on the accusation of genocide that South Africa's levied against Israel in the UN International Court of Justice. Does South Africa have a case?
Well, no. I mean, that's further posturing by South Africa. The International Criminal Court is never going to, the International Court of Justice is not going to agree any interim measures against Israel. So I don't think it will be a successful court case. And I don't see that as being really a very serious charge against Israel. However, you are right that the Houthis are using as an excuse for their attack on shipping the fact that they are hitting back against what Israel is doing in Gaza. And there's no doubt that if there was a ceasefire in Gaza, that would completely undercut the Houthis' raison d'etre for continuing to attack shipping.
Similarly,
and
Hamas could just give back the hostages, couldn't they? Equally, that is another way.
That's absolutely true. But I don't think there's much doubt that Israel has violated international humanitarian law since the 7th of October. They have a right of self-defense after the barbarous attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October. But the way they've gone about it, I'm afraid, in the short term is in violation of international humanitarian law, and in the longer term is most unlikely, as Netanyahu's claimed just recently, likely to improve Israel's longer term security.
Look, thank you so much for speaking to us. Sir Mark Lyle Grant, former UK ambassador to the UN, former national security advisor to the Prime Minister. Good to speak to you again, Mark. Appreciate it.
Good evening, Kate.
Thank you. Just another line from today as well, that there has been an unverified video released by Hamas who says that 2 Israeli hostages have been killed by Israeli airstrikes. That came out a little earlier today. This is Kate Borsay. It's the evening edition. Let's continue this story with a look at the US perspective. And earlier today, as we've mentioned, an American container ship was struck by a missile off the coast of Yemen. There were no injuries and the vessel remained seaworthy despite a fire that broke out. The Yemeni Houthi rebels were responsible for the attack, according to the company to which the ship belongs. We've heard today from the group who've warned that they'll expect expand their targets to include US ships, saying the US is on the verge of losing its maritime security. Well, joining me now, Jim Townsend, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for European and NATO policy. Good evening, Jim.
Good evening. How are you?
Great. Thanks for speaking to us, Jim. I wonder what you make of the latest attack. It is another retaliation by the Houthi rebels, but also their warning to the US. This is intriguing. Are we to take them seriously, that they're going to expand their targets to include US ships?
Well, it's interesting. I've always felt they were shooting at US ships anyway, at least the Navy ships that were out there. We were always wondering just what their target was. But the ship that was hit just recently was a U.S. It was U.S. flagship. So, but I think what's important to see is that they only fired one missile, and as you remember, just a few days ago, they set off quite a complex attack involving drones and various kinds of missiles, lots of different targets, and now the most they can manage is just one. It hit the ship, and I think that's the first ship that's actually been hit by one of these missiles. But obviously, the missile was not a very high explosive one, in that the ship seemed to be unscratched, and thank goodness. But I think what we're seeing is how the Houthi capability is degraded by these attacks, and we're also seeing that these attacks will not completely end. We're going to have to deal with
ship contest.
I mean, I always trust what Paul writes. He's so well informed. He's not someone who's given to hyperbole. It's also something that I hear quite a lot from Conservative MPs, that they may well have one more attempt at a leadership contest before the election. I don't think it would amount to anything. But I think we are effectively in a sort of de facto leadership contest anyway in the Conservative Party, and have been for a few months, because you've got so many MPs, I think Suella Braverman included, who have just decided they've lost the next election, so they might as well crack on with the leadership contest. And that's why they're behaving in this way that is, not the disciplined election winning machine that we've seen from the Conservatives over the past, 13, 14 years. They are behaving like a party that's having its sort of post-mortem in opposition. And I think that's the way to understand most Conservative behaviour.
Yeah, looks super interesting. Thank you, Isabel Hardman. We will let you go. Always great to speak to you, Assistant Editor at The Spectator. When we come back, we're on the ground in Iowa. We are, of course, kicking off the 2024 presidential election in terms of the Republican nominee for presidential candidate. It all starts in Iowa this evening. We'll go on the ground. We'll get some analysis as well from a Republican strategist. All that to come after the news with Daryl Jackson.